I'm talking today about the 60s, which is the name of, well, depending on how you classify it, it's either a TV movie or a TV miniseries. It was shown over two separate nights when it was aired on TV, each night a 2 hour chunk. So, because it was shown in two parts, I guess you'd call it a TV miniseries, except I believe it was practice at the time to call a lot of these TV movies that just aired in two parts. So I'm going to call this a TV movie or miniseries. I don't know. I'm going to call it one or the other. But this was a TV movie or miniseries about the decade, the 1960s, which aired in 1999. It was accompanied by a lot of hype the week that it was aired on television, as they do. I mean, the networks have got to hype it, right? They want people to watch it. So it was billed as this big television event, but it got absolutely terrible reviews. I know some people who watched it. I know some people who started to watch it and turned it off halfway through. And I think it's been largely forgotten ever since then. Or has it? Let me know in the comments down below what your memory of this TV movie is, or have you ever heard of it before, when, where, etc. So, given everything I've just said, that this is a largely forgotten, pretty bad TV movie, why am I watching this? Well, this is a little bit of a guilty pleasure on my part, but I do have a certain path that led me here. And if you will forgive me the digression, I'm going to take you down that path. So as I've mentioned in a few of my previous videos, the wife and kids are up at the wife's parents' house for an extended Tet holiday. I came back to Saigon for work, live and work in Vietnam. And because I've had the apartment to myself, I've decided to just watch a lot of videos on YouTube. I'm limited to YouTube. We don't have Netflix or anything like that, but we do have a smart TV, so I get to put them on the big screen in the living room. And I've been reviewing a few different movies. Watching a few different movies and then reviewing them on this channel. So if you've been watching me the past few days, you know what I've been up to. But in addition to watching classics like His Girl Friday and Lawrence of Arabia, I've also just been watching junk. Just put something on in the background while I eat the food, or where I clean up the kitchen, or something like that. My usual go-to when I'm looking for something interesting to watch on YouTube is just searching for old episodes of The Twilight Zone. The original Twilight Zone I was a big fan of. The last time I was home alone, I watched a few different episodes of the 1960s Twilight Zone. Sorry, have I been saying Twilight Zone? Outer Limits. The Outer Limits. The Outer Limits. Forgive me. Outer Limits is what I meant to say. Anyways, you know how YouTube is, though. Something, if it's not there legally, it will be there for a while, sometimes a surprisingly long time, but it gets taken down sooner or later. So this time around, it looks like most of those full episodes from the 1960s have gotten taken down. So I'm left with the Outer Limits from the 1990s, which I actually never watched when it was on the air. But I thought I'd watch a couple episodes just to see what it was like. It's not very good, is it? If you've ever seen the 1990s Outer Limits. But I had in a couple episodes. One episode I watched was called Time to Time. I knew nothing about it when I put it on, other than I was pretty sure it was going to be a time travel story because it was called Time to Time, and it's a science fiction TV show. And I thought, time travel stories can be pretty good. There's usually surprise endings, some twists along the way. Let's see where this is going. So the episode involves somebody traveling back from the present day, or the then present day, back into the 1960s in the middle of the student movement to reconnect with her dad. And I'm not going to get into the whole plot, but it struck me while I was watching it that this episode was very typical of the nostalgia for the 1960s, which was permeating the culture in the 1990s, and which I don't think exists to the same degree anymore that it did in the 1990s. Now, take me with a grain of salt, because I've been living abroad for years. I mean, via the magic of the internet, I'm able to keep in touch with the culture mostly. But, you know, I'm not in the country, I'm not in the coffee shops, etc. So, let me know if my perception is off, but I'm fairly sure this is a safe statement, right? In the 80s and 90s, there was just tons of nostalgia for the 1960s. And I think that's faded away as the baby boomers have gotten past their prime demographic and are now aging into retirement and past retirement. But if you grew up in the 80s and 90s like I did, you remember that there was all sorts of reminiscing about the 1960s going on. And it's a little bit embarrassing to admit, but I totally got caught up in that myth-making about the 1960s. I mean, it was just, there was just so much of it going on, and I was young and impressionable and stupid, and I just got caught up in the romanticization of the protest music and the civil rights and the drugs and the hippies and, oh, wasn't it so glorious to be alive back then? And read a lot about it, watched a lot about it, was active in campus politics and protest movement in part because of my romanticization of that period, which is going on all around me. I was young and foolish, but where was I going with this? Oh yeah. Anyways, watching this old Twilight Zone episode, Outer Limits episode, and this actually is not from the 1990s. It was from 2001, but close enough to the 1990s. Watching this 2001 episode, romanticizing the 1960s. And I just thought, oh, this is so classic of the media that was in the 90s. But the other thing that was interesting about it was that it was so bad. And it was so bad in a way that reminded me of a lot of the media from the 90s. It's interesting. I guess I have a couple different theses here. And let me know what you think of these. Am I off base? Does this sound about right to you? Number one, I've already mentioned, there was a tremendous wave of nostalgia for the 1960s, in the 80s and 90s, which does not exist in the culture to the same extent it did back then. But two, the media at that time was unable to depict the 1960s in any way that resembled real life. Now, I wasn't alive during the 1960s, but I know what human beings sound like. And I know what range of emotions is typical of a human being. And if you watch any of those movies from the 80s and 90s that are set in the 1960s, people are not real humans. They're walking billboards who communicate entirely by spouting cliches and spouting slogans, and have only one dimension to them. Just kind of, they're only defined by their politics or by their love of rock and roll music or their rebellion. They're not fully fledged human beings. And it's interesting to me that they just could not write about that decade, or could not film it, at least, as far as TV and movie goes, with anything resembling any sort of human touch to what it must actually been like to be a real life human being in that period. But I think as we've moved away from the nostalgia, the portrayals have gotten better. Maybe that's my third thesis here. So take, for example, the Aaron Sorkin movie about the trial of the Chicago 7 that came out a couple years ago. Did you see that movie, the trial of the Chicago 7 by Aaron Sorkin? In that movie, they come out, the characters come out as like real people. And I know it's a little bit over the top and a little bit cheesy because it's Aaron Sorkin dialogue. But they're interesting characters. They're not just walking billboards. And they're not just spouting off slogans. They're having real, actual conversations with each other. And it's interesting that we needed to get so far removed in time from the 1960s before we could write about it in a way that made the people in it seem like real human beings. I mean, you would think, right? You would think that in the 1990s, when the 1960s was closer in living memory, people would be able to use their own experiences and write about it in more realistic ways because they could remember it better. But they couldn't write about it in realistic ways. They could not write about the 1960s without just resorting to a checklist of cliches. Now, here's another little thesis I'm going to float. Maybe the reason they could not write about the 1960s without resorting to the cliches is because most people didn't actually live through these events, right? Most people were not at Kent State. Most people were not at the Chicago Convention. Most people did not march on the Pentagon. These were things that they saw on TV, and so they've just imagined that they're actually not writing about their own experiences. They're actually writing about what they think that these characters on TV would say. But I mean, it's I don't know. I guess the point is the stuff in the 1990s. They tried to talk about the 1960s a lot, but they just could not do it without resorting to a checklist of cliches and a checklist of slogans. And this TV movie from 1999 is like the preeminent example of it. It's like the perfect example of that. So as I was watching this old Outer Limits episode, and as I was thinking about the portrayals of the 1960s that have been filmed in the 1990s, I remembered this old TV movie, and I thought, I wonder if it's on YouTube. And sure enough, it is. I'll link to the version I saw down below. It's down in 2 parts. I actually never saw this when it was on TV at the time. I was very interested in it, partly because it was getting so much hype from the network. Although, right before it aired, if memory serves, the reviews came out, and the reviews were really terrible. So we were kind of warned to stay away from it from the reviews. But like I said, when I was young, I got caught up in that whole romanticization of the 1960s. So this was totally up my alley, despite the fact that it had gotten bad reviews. But I decided not to watch it because I was busy doing other stuff. And I was at that age. I was at an age where I was trying to cut down on the amount of TV I watched because this is getting a little bit too much into my personal story, but I had felt like I had been a huge geek in high school. And once I got into college, I felt like I had wasted my precious teenage years by being an introverted geek, and now is a time to go out and go to parties and be social and be cool. And I was just really doing my best to avoid sedentary introverted activities like watching movies for long periods of time. That's something I've long since reversed policy on. Now I like nothing better on a free night than to sit down and watch a movie. But that was my attitude at the time. So I caught clips of it. I think I was in the I wasn't in the dorms at the time, but I was in the college apartment. So I saw clips as I was wandering around from friend's apartment to friend's apartment. One of my professors talked about it in class the next day. I forgot how she got on the tangent about it, but she was going off about something about memory or something like that. And then she was talking about watching the 1960s TV movie. And she said, I was watching it, and I said to my husband, we could just turn this off right now. We don't need to watch this. She said, we could say these speeches alongside the characters. So why are we even watching it? And she made a good point there. And after now finally watching this movie, I can confirm this completely. The characters talk in cliches. So it's a type of movie where the dialogue is incredibly predictable. If one character says one line, you can kind of predict the next line that the next character is going to say, especially in certain scenes. Some scenes are better than others. But in some scenes, the writers just completely went into autopilot. And we're just completely relying on just whatever cliche came into the mind first. And in a way that makes it possible to just predict the dialogue. But aside from the normal just dialogue cliches, there's a number of speeches that the characters give which are not actually their own. They're lifted from from things that famous people said during the 1960s. And if you're familiar with some of those speeches, you'll be able to recognize it when you watch the movie. You're like, wait a minute. Those aren't her words. That's something that Mark Rudd said. But they've taken these famous speeches and inserted it into the mouths of their fictional characters. Anyways, all of that is to say, I never saw this movie at the time. I guess you could say I've been vaguely curious about it ever since it's stuck in my memory. And then having remembered about this the other day and having confirmed that there's a copy available on YouTube and not having the wife and kids around and this being like the 1 week I'm free to watch TV, I decided to watch it. It's in 2 parts. It's quite long, but it's quite long. I mean, it's close to 4 hours because I think each segment was 2 hours when it was broadcast. That's including commercials. On YouTube right now, it's 140 minutes, something like that. So you watch it, and it. Of course, I watched it over 2 nights, which is probably what you're meant to do. That's how it was broadcast. Now, it is long, but it's not. It moves very fast. I mean, it's just racing from one set piece to the other. So it's not necessarily difficult to watch. It's a classic. I mentioned before guilty pleasure, and guilty pleasure probably describes this pretty well. In so many ways, it's very terribly written, but in another way, it's completely watchable because they're both the script writers are just going from one cheap drama point to the other. So you're just kind of rolling your eyes as you're watching this. Like, I can't believe they're going to do this cliche as well. But you keep watching. You're like, well, all right. It's entertaining. I think it's entertaining. Yeah. Where to start with this one? So it's about two families, one white family and one black family. Because, of course, we're going to do all the cliches here. We want to get all the cliches of the black experience and the white experience. Now, what's an indication of how sloppily this thing is written is the two families, their story is completely unconnected. If somebody more talented had written this, we would have seen maybe these stories interweaving in more of a skillful way. There's a point of intersection in the first part of the movie when one of the white kids goes down to the civil rights movement and meets up with the black kid in the early 60s, like 1963, I think it is, or something, back in the early days of the civil rights movement. But then their stories are largely separate. Aside from the fact that they're both in Chicago at the same time, they don't really interact with each other. So the stories are pretty much separate. Add to that, the filmmakers are not really interested in the story of the black family, or at least the writers are not. So the story of the black kid is very much just like, oh yeah, and don't forget he's out there doing stuff as well. They cut back to him every once in a while, but they've got more than enough story to juggle with this white family. They've got 3 kids, and one of them is going to go to college. Well, spoilers, by the way. Go to college and become an anti-war activist. One of them is going to join the Marines and go fight in Vietnam. And one of them is going to get pregnant and then go out to Haight-Ashbury and join the hippie lifestyle. So we're doing all the cliches here. Now, the movie, there's a number of ridiculous things about this. First thing is it's never established how old each of them are in relationship to each other. I mean, we start off the movie and it seems like they're all 18. I mean, they all look 25. But, we're supposed to buy into the fact that they're supposed to be high school students at the time. I said they look 25. To be fair, I looked up the birth dates of some of them. And they actually were, they weren't 15, but they were, in about 20 when this film was made, not 25. But, they look like adults. And the film is just dedicated to hitting every single cliche you can imagine if you're talking about the 1960s. So it starts off right in the first scene. Not the first scene, but one of the very earliest scenes. They're going to a high school dance. The girl is going out on the dance floor. She's trying to get someone to dance with her. Her partner ditches her, so she just starts dancing with the black guy next to her. And then, because there's interracial dancing going on at this high school dance, the nun gets real upset and stops the dance, and it's this huge, big drama where her parents are really upset about this. I mean, I said huge, big drama, but the pace of the movie never really allows us to linger too much on any one set piece. And then we're just off to every single cliche you can imagine. You know how there are some action movies made nowadays where I guess people say the way that they make action movies nowadays is they decide what the action set pieces are going to be first, and then they hire the script writer, and he's got to write the movie around the action set pieces. this is kind of like the version of that, where they say, right, we're going to cram all these events from the 1960s in. You've got to write your story around that. So the characters are on the civil rights movement, the marches. They are at Newport when Dylan goes electric. They are at the March on the Pentagon. They are at the Chicago 1968 convention. They watch the moon landing on TV. They are at Woodstock. They are, one of them goes clean for Gene. They join all the groups. They do all the things. According to the IMDb, there's a scene cut from this movie which was apparently was part of this movie when it first aired on NBC back in the 90s, but then it was cut from all the rebroadcasts and cut from the VHS as well. I guess they were selling this movie on VHS at one time, where they watched the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. And I saw that and I thought, oh, of course that was in here, watching the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. I don't know why they cut it in subsequent broadcasts. I'm guessing because they didn't want to pay for the rights to the Beatles' music. Although, they must have paid a pretty penny for the soundtrack here. Because I think those old classic songs can be expensive to license, right? Or at least they used to be. But this is one of those classic cases of soundtrack overkill, where there's an iconic song from the 1960s that's played for 30 seconds every 2 minutes of the movie. I mean, and it's interesting because a lot of these songs, I'm thinking to myself, I haven't heard that in years. I used to hear that song all the time. Now, granted, of course, I'm living abroad, so maybe I'm out of touch, but I think, yeah, a lot of these songs you used to hear a lot more in the 90s, right? Right? It is, to give credit where credit is due, it is a good soundtrack. And there are any number of good 1960s songs that it reminded me of that I hadn't heard for years. The movie, yeah, the movie borrows widely from other people's stories, like I said before. So, for example, there's a documentary which came out in 1990 called Berkeley in the 1960s, which I saw back in the day because, like I said, I was really interested in this period back at that time. And they tell, one of the people they interviewed tells a story in that about how they're trying to, the student protesters were trying to disrupt the troop transport trains. So the trains which were bringing the soldiers to Vietnam, or I guess they must have been bringing them to the airport or bringing them to wherever they were going to ship out to Vietnam, the port or whatever. They had these trains running on the track, and the student protesters would block the trains so that the troops couldn't be transported to Vietnam. So somebody on that documentary had a story about how the train was coming, and there was one guy and he wasn't going to get out of the way. And then the train just came through, and everyone was like, did the train just run him over? And then as soon as the train goes by, you can see that the police had actually yanked him off at the last minute, and were holding him there. So that was a story that appeared in another documentary about the 1960s, and they just substituted it in for one of their characters. So everything in this movie is borrowed from somebody else's story. In a way that doesn't really work except as a guilty pleasure. I mean, so, for example, that same character I just mentioned, at the end of the movie, he becomes one of the radical terrorists that spin off from the student movement. And he blows himself up in a townhouse apartment while he's making bombs. Which, again, is a real thing that happened in the 1960s. 3 of the weathermen blew themselves up in a New York apartment while making a bomb. And they put it into the movie so that they take that story and now he blows himself up. And I shouldn't be laughing about it, but it's so clumsily done, because his ex-girlfriend is there. She's they're having like a final talk. She leaves. She's going out, and then they play the dramatic music while he's trying to light up a cigarette or a joint. Well, he's got the bomb, which by the way, that wasn't what happened in real life. It wasn't somebody was smoking too close to the bomb. I think they just got the wires crossed or something. And then she just barely gets out of the apartment, and then there's a big explosion. And I guess to give credit where credit is due, it's a big set piece explosion for a made-for-TV movie. Somebody paid a bit of budget for that. And then we cut to another scene, and we never hear about it again. So, surely in real life, she wouldn't have just walked away from an explosion like that, which would have killed a bunch of people. The police would have been involved. It would have been a long, complicated thing. And who knows? Maybe in the world of the movie, all of that happened off screen. I don't know. But it's just ridiculous that they just kind of shoehorn that part in and then move on to the next part. And the whole movie is like that. Oh, yeah. This is the other really terrible part. There are so many terrible parts. The black kid ends up, I think according to IMDb, he's the bodyguard for Fred Hampton. Although I'm getting that information from IMDb. Just my own impression watching it is he's one of... He joins the Black Panthers and he's one of Fred Hampton's crew. Fred Hampton eventually convinces him to go back to his home where his father was killed. And then, as the scene ends, they have like those little letters that the subtitles that says Fred Hampton was later assassinated in his sleep in 1969. And I thought, oh, just going to drop that in there and then rush on to the next scene. And this is partly because they're just not interested in telling the story of the black kid. So they drop Fred Hampton in there for a couple scenes, but they do not want to get bogged down telling the story of Fred Hampton's assassination. And to be fair, that is a fairly big can of worms to open. It's not something you just rush through, although this is the kind of movie where you just rush through everything. As a movie, it's terrible. And it's terrible in a very obvious way, which is they're trying to cram in every single moment from the 1960s into this movie. But in real life, people didn't experience everything firsthand. I was thinking of like Victor Hugo's novel, Les Miserables, right? Which is also about student radicals and revolution and all that kind of stuff. But Victor Hugo had the big set piece of his novel being this little obscure uprising in 1932 that was not a big deal in the ultimate course of history, in which people say nobody would even remember these days if it wasn't for his novel. Imagine if Victor Hugo had wrote Les Miserables, but instead he had tried to connect every single event of the Restoration monarchy into the lives of his characters. And they just happen to be there at every single big event. I mean, it would have been a terrible book. I mean, it wouldn't have been a story. It would have just been a list of, hey, remember this? Hey, remember this? So, of course, this movie doesn't work at all as a movie or as an actual story. But then it was not meant to. It was just meant to be a celebration or a reminiscence of the 1960s. And perhaps as an educational tool, it may have some value or not. I mean, the thing is, so many of the events it depicts, it does not explain it all. It just shows like a 2-second video clip of something, and the audience is immediately meant to connect what they saw with the whole history that they know, because this is playing off of nostalgia. This is meant to be watched by people who are already familiar with the history, and are just, the movie is helping them experience their nostalgia. Now, in like 100 years, when everyone who remembers the 1960s is dead, and it's not so much a part of our culture, would this movie be a good educational tool for somebody who was taking in, a high school history student who needed a crash course on all the big events in the 1960s? Probably not, because the movie doesn't really explain anything properly. It just shows it like, hey, remember this, remember this. Now, I guess the other big question, which I've been not addressing this whole time, is what were the 1960s anyways? Because I don't know. We probably don't want to open this can of worms at this point in the review, but the people who lived through the 1960s were convinced that it was a monumentous time of change, and that everybody who lived through it was marked by it. But it does make you wonder if this is partly just baby boomer nostalgia for their own youth, or if the 1960s was really a unique decade. I mean, a lot happened during the 1960s, don't get me wrong, but a lot's always happening. I mean, within my own lifetime, we've had the September 11 attacks, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, the first black president, the whole debacle of Trumpism, and America losing its mind and getting really divided, and the Black Lives Matter protests, and the COVID and the isolation, where we all had to spend like a year and a half locked in our houses. Were the 1960s really that unique in the way that the people who lived through them think they were? Or was this just the normal coming of age for every generation? I guess it must have been... Sorry. I'm thinking out loud as I talk. It must have been unique, huh? Because the way the people who lived through it talked about it was different than the way other generations talked about their own coming of age. I mean, people don't talk about the 90s like that, huh? But it is, yeah. Watching this movie, the movie I was on, yeah, sorry, let me back up a little bit. There's no Wikipedia page for this movie, which is an indication of how completely forgotten it is, right? I mean, if something does not have a Wikipedia page, how obscure does it have to be? There's Wikipedia pages for everything. There is an IMDb page for this movie, though, and you can get some little tidbits on IMDb. You can also get some reviews of this movie. And I mentioned before that everyone forgot about this movie, but there are 12 reviews, 66 reviews. 66 reviews. I'm just displaying the first 12 here. But you scroll down and look at these reviews, and a lot of them were written in 1999 or 2000 or 2001. So this was written at the time it came out. I'm surprised that these reviews are still preserved here on the internet. I was thinking anything from the 1990s would have been forgotten. Here's one reviewer. He says there was way too much hype that followed this miniseries. Yeah, there was a lot of hype when this came out. But there are other reviewers who are more conservative in their outlook, who are angry at this movie because it romanticizes protest, and it does a little bit. Here's one called New Left Propaganda, complaining about how this movie is yeah. You can go to IMDb page and read these for yourself. But the movie does kind of romanticize the protest movement and getting involved and making a difference. In fact, there are speeches at the beginning. This movie is all about characters standing up and making speeches. But one of the professors says, I believe and we can all change the world and we can all make a difference. And, that romanticization of the protest movement and that rhetoric was very much in the air when I was growing up. And so it was interesting to just be reminded of this when I was watching the movie and to think, okay, I'm guilty of having over-romanticized student protests. I'm guilty of having an overly romantic view of progressive politics and getting involved with stuff. And I was young and stupid and all that stuff, but given how much this was in the culture at the time, how can I blame my young self? Of course, an impressionable young 17-year-old or 18-year-old is just going to eat this stuff up, and just going to get seduced by it. The allure of protest, and protest was always portrayed in a very cinematic way in these movies. So it's an interesting reminder of the way that the 60s was very romanticized in the 1990s. There is a ton more you could talk about with this movie. This would be the perfect movie to do a video essay on, like those guys like Nostalgia Critic and Bad Movie Beatdown, where they just take a movie and show clips of it and make fun of it. I have barely even scratched the surface of all the really cringe, corny scenes in this movie. Like, for example, the end of the movie, there's a big family reunion, and everyone's happy and together. And then there's this guy shows up, and there's this really big deal of like, oh, hey, how are you doing? Haven't seen you in years. And I'm like, they're making such a big deal out of this guy. Who was he? I think he was a character from their high school who had showed up for like 2 minutes at the very beginning of the movie, and then we never hear about him again. And then, I don't know if he had cut scenes or something like that, but then they're making such a big deal of him coming back. There's just so many ridiculous scenes like that, in addition to all the corny cliches. That being said, I would be lying to you if I didn't say in all honesty that some of the sentimentality in this movie got me a little bit teary-eyed. So when the girl comes back with her baby, who is now grown into a young child, and she gets reunited with her parents, or when she's struggling to take care of this toddler and she's out on the streets. This is when she's in the hippie scene, and she's struggling to take care of her baby in Haight-Ashbury. Those human elements there did get me feeling a little bit teary-eyed and a little bit emotional, even though I hated myself to giving into it, because I knew that this was just such a cheap, manipulative, cheesy movie. But there you are. It got me. It must be admitted. And at that note, I think I've rambled on long enough. So thank you for indulging me.